Welcome to the Woman Worriers podcast, where we're working to help you call a truce with your anxiety. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional. Now, here's your host, Elizabeth Cush, LCPC.
Hi, and welcome back to the Woman Worriers podcast. I'm your host, Elizabeth Cush, and I am a licensed clinical professional counselor here in Annapolis, Maryland, where I am providing online therapy all the time because of the pandemic, because it feels important to keep everyone safe. So if you're in Maryland and in need of therapy, you can find me at progressioncounseling.com. You can also find the podcast at womanwarriors.com. You can follow us on social media at Woman Worriers on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also sign up for the newsletter and get the episodes delivered directly to your inbox. So if you go to womanwarriors.com, scroll to the bottom of the page, there is a form you can fill out there for the newsletter. Or you can go to progressioncounseling.com/Elizabeth's newsletter and sign up there. So today I'm talking to Michelle Farris. She is a therapist out on the West Coast who specializes in anger management. And as I've discussed and shared here on the podcast, anger is an emotion, a feeling that I have a difficult time, one, recognizing, but two, expressing. I tend to worry more than I express my anger. I tend to keep it in instead of letting my more warrior self express my anger because I was never really taught how to do that. And it doesn't feel comfortable, but I'm working on it. And today we are talking about the cultural constraints of women's anger. And of course, because of the civil rights demonstrations and anger about racism, that has come into the conversation as well. To be clear, we are two white women, and we are finding and exploring ways, we are talking about and exploring ways to express our anger and to hear the anger of others in more grounded and meaningful ways. If you would like to learn more about the power of women's anger, I recommend Soraya Chemaly's work. Her TED Talk and her book, Rage Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger, are two really great resources. I will provide links to those in the show notes. And now more about our guest today. Michelle Farris is a marriage and family therapist who specializes in codependency, anger management, and relationship skills. In her private practice, she helps people make small but significant changes with simple tools that are easy to practice. She also has written 3 ebooks and creates online courses to support growth and learning. And today we're going to be talking about anger and how to express anger in healthy ways. But I would also like to talk to her about receiving anger when people are mad at us because of the protests and the Black Lives Matter and the deaths of too many Black people at the hands of police. There's a lot of anger that's focused at white people, which I totally understand and feels somewhat deserved. But I would like to also talk to her about how we can receive that, if that comes up in conversation, how we receive that and listen and hear people who may be angry at us. So let's get started. Hi, Michelle, and thank you so much for being on the Woman Worriers podcast.
Oh, Elizabeth, thank you so much for having me. You really do a great service here.
Oh, I appreciate your saying that. And I would love it if you would share a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to do the work that you do.
Sure. So I'm a psychotherapist in San Jose, California. And one of my first internships was in anger management. I actually got a chance I wanted a paid internship, which was very few and far between.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
so I saw one advertised for teaching 52-week court mandated anger management. And I don't know, there was something about that. I thought, okay, I'm going to try it. And it's funny because sometimes when I tell my colleagues, I work with anger management, they kind of go, ugh, like the topic is so, which is so indicative of the misconception. But what I found was I could relate so much to the men because they all grew up in violence.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was really easy for me not to go into judgment because most of them were willing to learn. And years later, I didn't realize the personal part was that I had lived with someone who raged quite a bit. And so maybe that was part of the reason why my ears perked up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because, I learned because of that to stuff my anger. And I thought, anger is dangerous, so I'm not going to do it. Thank you very much. And that was just as destructive, honestly.
Yeah. Oh, I know. And typically, you said working with men. So oftentimes the court mandated programs are either for, domestic violence abusers,
Yes.
but also just people who I guess are getting into trouble because of their anger in other instances. Yeah. I worked on the other side of it with domestic violence victims. So we worked closely with programs that did the abuser intervention as well as anger management stuff. Yeah.
Such important work.
It is such important work. Now, for me, anger has been a very difficult emotion to identify, but also express.
Yes.
And I think that as I'm, I hate to admit that, being almost 60 and I'm still learning how to identify my anger, but really oftentimes it like, as you said, it just either feels dangerous or it's been so ingrained in me to not express anger. It's interesting when now like realizing like, oh yeah, I was really mad right then, but part of me actually goes to tears versus
yes,
I get choked up and it's very hard for me to be just mad and not mad and upset too. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. And there's reasons for that because I think we were all cultured as women to be quiet, be nice, look pretty, don't, make a fuss. And we didn't get taught that anger was actually a really valuable emotion. But then on the flip side, little boys got taught, oh, well, those are boys get angry. So they get the permission, but we don't.
Yeah.
And it's very powerful because I agree. I think a lot of women come to me and they don't even recognize that they're angry.
Yeah.
And their partners are saying, hey, you're super critical, you're yelling at the kids, you're yelling at me, but they don't see it. It's a real blind spot, and it's not a judgment. It's just that we're not taught to, like you said, to really pay attention to, one, what anger looks like in us, and two, that it's really a valid human emotion that has a lot of gifts in it, because essentially anger signals us that something isn't right. Now, that can be something external, right? Someone crosses our boundary, someone does something hurtful, or it can be something internal where maybe I'm not taking care of myself, maybe I'm not saying no where I should. So it's really important to kind of recognize what that feeling is. And I was listening to your podcast about stress, and that was so good.
Yeah, that was a good one.
It was really good. And I think that it's the same for anger with that fight or flight reaction. And our body will tell us almost immediately that we're upset. whether it's that heart rate, which is probably the most common, sweating, feeling choked up. Like sometimes when I'm angry, my throat closes.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Me too.
Yeah. And just noticing like, oh, what's your body telling you? Because it's screaming, pay attention.
Yeah. Boy.
Something is going on here.
And our bodies are so smart and we don't listen.
I know. And that's why, when I do my anger counseling, I think that's the biggest shift I help people make early on, is to just start recognizing what their anger looks like. And they're not bad. They're not bad for being angry. They're not bad for unhealthy behavior because they were taught it. Right. So it's a matter of how do you start to shift that and practice anger in its healthy form so that it doesn't create destruction in your life.
Yeah. Well, that was going to be my next question. So perfect segue of like, how, so there are healthy ways to express anger, right? I mean, there are ways that we can get across that if, our boundary has been crossed or whatever, somebody's done something cruel or unkind, and, we can talk about it in a way that we can be heard, right? Or hopefully be heard.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference between unhealthy anger and healthy anger is blame. It's the focus, because whenever you hear unhealthy anger, it's almost always targeted at someone, right? You did this, you did that, name calling, screaming, you made me feel a certain way, versus healthy anger is about, I'm angry. I need to name it. When you didn't return my text all day, I got angry.
Yeah.
So we're labeling it, but we're also naming the behavior in a non-judgmental way, because what I find people do is they can do the first part. They can say they're angry, but then it's a loaded gun after that by saying something like, well, I feel you're attacking me. People do not, we all don't like hearing that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the first thing we're going to say is, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
But if someone says, Michelle, you just screamed at me, or you just called me a name, I can't really fight that because I actually did that. So if I actually did that, I'm going to go, you know what? I need to look at that. Because if they can name what the behavior is that's causing them upset without judgment and without generalization, like you always, you never, that's the other trap people go into. You always do this. And it's like, no, you don't.
Right. Yeah.
So it's really powerful. I guess that's why I really like working with anger, because the tools are really practical and it's something you can do today. You don't need to be in therapy for years to make progress with anger.
Yeah, that makes sense. That there are concrete things that you can work on that can help you communicate it in a way that is healthier than blaming and shaming somebody else.
That's right. Because even just that focus, if your focus goes from you messages to I messages, that's going to totally transform how you communicate your anger.
Yeah. And I think that can be such a that's such a subtle point too, though, like versus like,
it is.
You did this and you made me feel, versus when you did this, I felt whatever, or, like when you didn't return my text messages, I felt angry. I was hurt. I was whatever. Yeah.
And that's a really good point, the way you just spoke it, when you did this, I felt, because a lot of times I find with men, they don't like the I message. They don't want to start with I feel. It feels too vulnerable. It feels wimpy to them, but they will do the opposite. Like you just did, is when you did this, I felt. And sometimes I'll just say, even if you just say you feel uncomfortable, that's a start. Versus, some people aren't going to drop into hurt or disappointed or discouraged or fear, but they can say, I feel uncomfortable with that. It kind of opens the door.
Absolutely. So yeah. For a conversation or to be heard.
Right.
Yeah. And do you find that, being a a therapist that specializes in helping with anger management. Is it typically men who come to see you about working on anger? Is that something, or is it pretty evenly?
I would say yes. Men call me more, and it's almost always because they're about to lose their relationship over it. So it usually, men have to hit a pretty big bottom in order to call me. Women may come in and it's so interesting. They'll say, well, I have an anger problem because my partner says I do. Sometimes they'll see it, but a lot of times, and you know what, to be fair, that's probably true with men as well. Sometimes they see it, sometimes they don't. But I do see women as tending to justify it more because they feel hurt. So they don't see their anger as abusive or unhealthy because they feel it's justified.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so right now, there's a lot of anger in our with the deaths of Black men and women by police, and a lot of years and years of social injustice and racism in our country. So for me, I'm working hard to address it in my own internalized racism, trying to work toward being a more aware white person. But
yes, me too.
But I know that I will probably make missteps along the way, and have made missteps, just either saying the wrong thing or being ignorant about my own biases. So how do we work with hearing someone else's anger? Like, how do we be on the other side of it? Like, if somebody is angry with us, whether it's about, incredibly emotionally charged things, which usually it is, how do we receive that anger in a way, especially if it's justified?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important to be able to make space for anger, especially right now, because when we're angry, and I'm sure, you can relate to this, when you're angry, you don't want to be told, don't be angry.
Oh yeah.
That's incredibly invalidating. Yeah. And part of what I think this movement is happening and occurring right now is that we need to make space for people's anger because it's valid. And how we do that, you're right. I mean, as white women, we have to educate ourselves because giving advice, giving platitudes, saying that we understand really isn't helpful because we can't. Right. We can't possibly understand the level of trauma the Black community has suffered. Right. I mean, and educating ourselves. And it's interesting because I've been, of course, reading about this like most people lately. And, the people of color don't want to be our dictionary. We don't need to go to them and say, hey, what do you think I should do? Teach me how to be
a better white person.
Right? That's right. We need to do that ourselves in show of support that we cannot tolerate this behavior anymore. And being able to sit with, it's so interesting because I've really noticed on social media, everything is blowing up around this.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've noticed that. But it's like, how do we really give space to people talk about their anger, but not demonize them? And especially politically, because there's so much to this. It's challenging to have these conversations and not get into such right-wrong mentality. Even myself, I've gone into, with the political part, getting really frustrated. And then I have to back up and go, you know what? I don't know their experience. I don't know where they come from. Because the one thing I notice with anger management issues is that people can judge how people act, right? The abusive anger on the outside and say, oh my God, that's horrible, right? And of course we all would, because that is horrible behavior. However, there is always a story behind it. And that to me is where we need to listen is, even when we totally disagree with somebody's politics or somebody's view on what's happening in the world, you know, how can we have these conversations without demonizing each other, and know when we can't and need to stop? And, you know, I've seen a few threads where you couldn't pay me to comment because
yes,
it's just way too volatile, and there's no point. There's no point. I can't contribute there. So I let other people, because, you know, some people find social media and they just, it's kind of scary that what they feel they can write without realizing how hurtful it is. So
but the
I don't know
demonizing, but the demonizing, like being able to listen, make space for someone else's anger when, you know, when you're really wanting to hear them. It's like giving yourself the permission to listen, I guess.
Yeah.
Without having to defend yourself. Right. Yes. Right. Or turn around and try to create this space, this, you know, judge ourselves, but also sort of try to validate why we said what we did or whatever, to be able to hear that maybe what I did wasn't okay.
Yeah. And I think that's the common trap that people get into, is when somebody's angry, they want to squelch it or they want to fix it. And so many of the men I see, they do that with their wives. The minute their wives get angry, they want to shut it down because they don't know what to do. Yeah. They get scared and they don't realize they're getting scared. They just go to fixing it. And women do that too, in different ways. But it's really powerful to be able to try to really be present versus trying to fix it and change it. Because right now we can't fix it. The only fix is uniting together and trying to do better. Yeah. But we can't fix this level of anger overnight, you know? I mean, it's just, it needs to be heard. And I think that's why it's blown up so much, because it just needs to be out there. And, you know, again, it's a really hard situation.
I want to talk a little bit about, you know, we did it at the very beginning, but about women and anger, stereotypes around angry women in particular, but too, I feel like angry women in general, but too, I've heard from Black colleagues, angry Black women, like it can be, we can just be labeled, shut down, like you don't matter, like because you're this, you're irrational, you're out of your head, or you're whatever. Yeah. So.
Yeah. I think women in general definitely get that label, they're a bitch, right away when they're angry. But what I notice and what I read with Black women is that they get labeled it, and they get raised to be strong, assertive women because they've had to deal with so much mistreatment. So they have to be on guard a lot. Whereas the white woman, you know, we get taught, I know for me, I got taught, shh, be quiet.
Yes.
You know,
so don't make waves, don't speak up, don't be too loud, don't be too much.
Right. And, you know, that's where it gets really damaging, because we don't see our anger as valid. But with Black stereotypes, they only get known for being angry, which is not fair, because they have vulnerability, they have other emotions, just like white women have anger.
Yeah.
You know, it's like we have to see it. And you know, the other thing is that Black women have a right to be angry based on what they've had to go through.
Right. And just by saying you're, you know, creating this stereotype of the angry Black woman, it just minimizes the depth of that anger, I think.
Right, because it's a response to their trauma.
Yeah.
But instead, because we don't see it that way, they get labeled. Versus also women who get angry, they become the bitch, and then the conversation stops. There's no, why are they angry? You know, what is going on that they are so angry? We don't care about the reason, and we need to.
Yeah. So how do we make space? How do we make space for the anger that's happening now, but just anger in general, like as it comes up in our relationships, because it does, whether it's with your children or your partner or your coworker or your boss or whatever. So how do we make space either to make space within ourselves to express it, but how do we make space to hold some of the collective anger?
Yeah. Well, I think in personal relationships, we have to remember their anger is their anger. It's not necessarily our fault. It's not something we caused. It's, people have a right to be angry, but if you have a background of trauma or rage in your background, you're going to react very quickly to that. So you have to be really mindful of your own space. Like what I tell people if you're starting to want to try to make space for anger, notice how much space you need. So that's why I never recommend arguing in the car because people get really heated because there's nowhere to go.
Yeah.
But if you're, say, arguing with your partner and you realize, you know what, I'm not feeling safe, back up. Make sure there's plenty of space between you. It's funny because my husband and I do this naturally where when we're arguing, we usually have our kitchen island, between us. and I realize that makes us both feel safe. I can be a little loud, and let's face it, we all will. I mean, healthy anger is not quiet and polite.
No.
But it's not mean, and it's not demeaning, and it's not hurtful. Because I can say to my husband, I'm really pissed that you're not listening to me. But I'm not making him wrong. I'm just naming the behavior. But I also have to be mindful of how hot I get, because in relationship, especially in intimate relationships, we all have our own triggers. So if I've never felt heard in my life and my husband doesn't hear me, I'm going to get hot much faster. But that's not because of what he's doing in the moment. That's also because of all the hundreds of other times that I've never felt heard.
Yes.
So it's not really fair to make him pay the price for that. So being aware of your triggers in relationship can be really, really powerful. Like not feeling heard, feeling abandoned, feeling left out, feeling like, oh, this person doesn't like me. So you go into that situation with those negative beliefs, and it's going to make it harder to actually hear somebody's anger. Instead of one of the tools I teach a lot is positive self-talk. Being able to say to yourself, you know what, I can handle this. Or this person has a right to be angry, but I don't have to take it personally.
Right.
I can keep myself safe. And if I don't feel safe, I need to excuse myself.
Yeah.
Because that's the other part with anger is if we feel like we have to just sit and take it, that's not good either. Because if somebody has crossed the line into screaming and name calling, there's no point in continuing the discussion because they've lost control.
Yes. And you don't want to put yourself at risk of either getting hurt or just sitting and taking hurtful anger.
Right. So finding that line of when the argument becomes toxic, you want to be able to catch that really quickly, because if you don't, again, it's really hard to leave an argument when you're both enraged. But it's easier if you're angry, but you're still in control of it, of yourself, really.
Yeah. Well, and just you mentioning, trauma triggers and thinking about all the anger we're seeing today. I think sometimes it's what I've seen on Facebook and what I've heard people say that, like, I don't understand why Black people are so mad about slavery that happened 400 years ago. And that's their trauma, right? They're carrying that trigger, so that to be unheard around that abuse and that, and then have experienced racism probably their whole life because of our country's, the way we've designed our country doesn't serve them well. I see that they'd be pretty angry.
Yeah. And that's where, I think people are realizing they have to educate themselves. And really, I've been watching videos, I've been listening to experiences of Black women who are mothers, who are afraid for their young sons. I mean, this is incredible. But if we don't know that and we've never dove into that, then we're not going to understand. And I think that's the opportunity we have now is if you don't understand, get educated. There's so much material out there right now, because that's the great thing is that I think we're being met by leaders who are giving us that information. There's tons of articles. I gave some resources to my email list, and they were so thankful because we do need to educate ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, the other thing though that I saw, and I thought it was really interesting, is I think some of this is people who can't see other people's pain is really indicative of them not being able to process their own. So when they hear something like Black Lives Matter and they say, well, all lives matter, they don't really see that they're justifying their own, hey, well, it's not that bad. We all had trauma. But sometimes I think they're not, because they haven't been able to deal with their own, they have less compassion for someone else's, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah, it's like, I can't see your pain.
Right, because I'm still hurt.
Yeah, mine is blinding me.
Yeah.
So if there were things that you felt might help women in particular be able to, respond either to someone else's anger or to express their own anger, regardless of what the situation is, how do we get to that space of feeling more grounded and calm to be able to share what's happening for ourselves?
Well, I think paying attention to the body and what your body is telling you, because we may not be able, I know when I first started doing my own anger work, I was not ready to say I felt angry in the moment. That was way too scary. But what I could do is I could pay attention to what was happening and go, okay, how do I feel? And then I would go and I would do some journal writing, or I would take a walk and talk to myself out loud, talk to myself during the walk and get it out. But it's like being able to cultivate my own permission to have my feelings and recognize what my anger was. To me, that's the first piece of the work.
Yeah.
And then when okay, yes, I am upset or angry, then we're able to actually start to put words to it. But it's a process. It's not something that especially for women, I think women who are people pleasers or tend to have codependent issues, it takes a while for them to undo that belief of it's not okay to be angry, So I think honestly paying attention to it and just cultivating that you have a right, because every time we're angry, there's always a reason. It's not something like, oh, I shouldn't feel this way, or, oh, that's stupid. I shouldn't be hurt by what so-and-so did to me. Well, sometimes we get upset over what looks like trivial things, but there's a story attached to it that isn't trivial. Yeah. And that's what we need to get to is, hey, wait a minute. Now I understand why I'm so angry and upset at my partner, because I've been abandoned my whole life. So when he goes on his phone and does it one more time, I'm enraged.
Yeah, I think that is such a key point that, looking at what's come before and kind of fed that anger all along.
Right.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times anger is not just in the moment. Almost always when we start talking about anger, they'll tell me an incident and I'll say, well, what was your stress level that day? Oh, it was pretty bad, but I didn't I thought I was okay. I hadn't eaten all day. You know what I mean? And they say stuff like that. And it's like, that's all part of the puzzle.
Yes.
Are you taking care of yourself? Are you speaking your truth? Are you holding on to a lot of resentments? Because all of that is going to make, when you get home and see a dirty house, more upsetting. Because it's not just about the dirty house, it's about all the other things that are on your back that you haven't spoken about.
And then right, that one more thing that gets loaded on breaks your back or tips the scales or whatever.
Right.
Well, it's so similar to how I work with my clients around anxiety is that,
Mm-hmm.
they'll say, I had a panic attack out of nowhere. And I'm like, okay, well, let's walk it back. Like, let's start with how your day started. And
that's right.
Where did the stress begin and when did you notice it? And
that's so
often,
powerful.
Yeah.
Because then they realize, oh, sorry.
No, yeah, go ahead. I just said it builds, but go ahead. Then they realized,
Then they realize that they do have some power in the situation because you're helping them see, oh, there were little microcosm, micro choices they made along the way that they could shift so that they don't have that panic attack. I love that. I love that you're doing that.
Well, and one last thing too, like I try to reinforce for clients that like there's no bad feelings. Like there shouldn't be like good and bad feelings. Like we just feel what we feel. But anger gets a pretty bad rap for as an emotion.
Yeah. Well, sure, because if we saw yelling, screaming, hitting, it is going to have that negative connotation.
Yeah.
Abusive anger is not what we want.
Right. But rage is not what we want. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But anger in its original form is healthy.
Right.
And if we can deal with it as it's happening, then it's not going to get destructive, or it's much less likely to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Such a good conversation. I feel like for me, the process of recognizing and expressing my anger in healthy ways is still ongoing, but I really appreciate you taking the time, Michelle, to stop in today and talk to us about it and how we can hold others' angers in a more compassionate way too.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was really enjoyable. I love talking about anger, but I also love hearing about the work you're doing. So thanks so much for doing this podcast. People need it.
Oh, thank you. So how do people find you, Michelle?
So my website is counselingrecovery.com. Mm-hmm. And I have a Facebook page on the same name, and I do online courses. So I do have an online course on anger and some other products on anger, like an ebook. I also have a free email course on there too, if people want to get started and just see if they want to put their toe in and start learning.
That's awesome. Cool. Well, that's good to know that resource is out there.
Good.
All right. Well, thanks again. And I just really appreciate you taking the time to be on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Michelle about anger, expressing it, hearing it, being with it, and just identifying it. As I said, for me, it's really hard sometimes to know that I'm angry. It can turn into hurt, or I get choked up and sometimes cry when I'm angry. And so I am learning to notice when it is that it's anger showing up and learning how to express my anger in healthy ways. So I appreciated Michelle being on the podcast to talk about that. I also appreciated her willingness to talk to us about how we hold people of color and Black, Indigenous people of color's anger right now and hear it and validate it, because there's a lot to be angry about. I also want to own that as two white women talking about Black, Indigenous people of color's anger, my intention was not to be racist about that and not to present that from a white normative standard. So I hope that was how the conversation came off. If it did not, that is mine to own, and I would love feedback on that. I would love to hear from you if you felt that there were missteps there or some unconscious racism that seeped through. So if you would like more resources on how to find Michelle, but also her anger management and courses on anger management, I will include all the links in the show notes. I will also include some links on learning how to be a white ally. I appreciate your joining us here today. Ciao for now from this Woman Warrior.
Thanks for listening and subscribing to the Woman Worriers podcast. Music was written and performed by Andy Cush. If you'd like more information on this episode, you can find the show notes, the resources shared today, and links to the guests' profiles at womanwarriors.com.